Today we are going to be talking about Pilates, specifically for autistic people, and I'm very delighted to welcome...
Just to run on like David Brent.
Any of you that are listening to me rattle on will know that I have a theory that autistic people attract autistic people, and we see this time and time again that in playgrounds that autistic kids are kind of naturally gravitating towards other autistic children, whether they know they're autistic or not. There's definitely something which kind of links people that are similar, which kind of makes sense in some way. And Karen and I are a perfect example of that. Karen and I met when we both worked at a college about 20 years ago. Neither of us knew very much about autism, I don't think, really. Asperger's was just about being kind of talked about. I know I used to support the odd student with Asperger's, didn't know anything about it at all. Karen and I ended up sharing a house together, and we've been super best buds for the last 20 years. And during that time, both of us have ended up with autism diagnoses. But neither of us knew anything about autism when we started. So it's true! Yes. We magnetise towards
gravitate towards each other.
Karen is an amazing practitioner in terms of autism and mental health. Are you going to do a little tell people?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
So I will leave it to Karen.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Hi. Okay. Nice. It's very nice to be here. I got up at 5 o'clock this morning and travelled from Brighton to do this, so I'm committed. I'm sort of in for the long haul. So my name's Karen, and I am an autistic adult as well. So I'm here to talk to you about Pilates specifically for autistic people. There's lots of interesting anecdotal and some scientific evidence about autistic bodies and how autistic bodies are different from non-autistic bodies. So we see lots of interesting co-occurrences in autistic people that we don't see so much of in non-autistic people. So things like being hypermobile, things like maybe having more incidences of people having things like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, fatigue-related illnesses. And about 4 years ago, I retrained to be a Pilates teacher. So I'm still an autism practitioner, but my side hustle, if you like, is that I teach Pilates, but I only teach Pilates to people who are neurodiverse. So I don't do fitness Pilates in a gym. I do very specific Pilates with people with a neurodiversity to help with things like coordination. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm very, very happy. If you're not sure about anything or I get a bit technical, just ask, okay? So if you think, what on earth is she going on about? Just, let me know. So this is a nice quote, but Joseph Pilates, who created the Pilates method, is quite an interesting person, and he has lots of fantastic quotes. So that's one of his quotes, that civilization impairs physical fitness, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later. So, that's not working. There we go. Right, so who am I and what do I know about Pilates and autism? So I've been an autism and mental health practitioner for 17 years. So before that, I trained to be a counsellor, and then I worked in FE with people like Sarah, and then I stayed in FE but doing a very specific role. So I did pastoral support, so like counselling, youth work, and I worked with lots of neurodiverse people and autistic people. I'm also a mental health practitioner, so I now work at universities with students who have mental health and autism, so they have a crossover. So they have their autistic challenges, but also their mental health challenges, and quite often the two things cross over, as I'm sure many people in this room know. So I've been teaching Pilates for about 3 or 4 years, but I didn't go and train to be a Pilates instructor in a gym. I trained to be a Pilates instructor with a clinical physiotherapist who specialised in functional movement. So I'm not I don't get my stretchy pants on and kind of get down the gym in terms of my Pilates. It's very much about people's functional movement and improving things like coordination. All of us have a tendency to hold ourselves in a certain way that can lead to postural difficulties or problems later on. And quite often, if we're autistic people and we do a specific job, we tend to kind of get hyper-focused and do it for longer than other people. So things like sitting at a computer, if we get into a hyper-focus, we might sit at that computer in the same position for a really, really long time. And eventually, over time, that actually changes the shape of our body. So we have to kind of think sometimes about how we can counteract that by doing some different movements or some stretching or whatever. So I've got my own clinical diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. I am hypermobile and hypertonic, so you can be both. So hypermobile means that your joints are looser than they're meant to be, and hypertonia means that your muscles are tighter than they are meant to be. And you can have both. So for me, I've got hypermobile hips and hypermobile knees and hypermobile wrists, but I've got hypertonic muscles in my kind of the core, the trunk of my body, which actually was so tight at one point they were pulling my hip out of its socket. And it was only when I was sort of diagnosed with autism that I actually realised that things were connected, because I'd always had like a postural problem and I thought it was just my body, but actually I've been able to correct it all through seeing an osteopath and doing Pilates. And I was born with double hip dysplasia. And this is quite an interesting condition because they did a study on it, I think at Sussex University a couple of years ago, and that lots of autistic women are born with hip dysplasia. There's a co-concurrence with babies being born with hip dysplasia, and then later on in life, the same babies being women who were diagnosed with autism. So there's this really interesting kind of connection between our bodies almost being hyper and hypo, as well as other things in our lives. So our bodies either being too loose or too tight. And I find that quite interesting, that there's this kind of hypo and hyper, even in our physical selves, not just kind of in the way we think about things or process information. Has anybody got any questions before we move on to the next bit? Yeah?
What is dysplasia?
Dysplasia is where you're born either with the joint hasn't formed properly, so it's not like a proper ball and socket joint, the joint's too shallow, or they're dislocated. So I was born with dysplasic and dislocated hips. So I had to wear like a nappy that was like, I don't think they do it anymore because it's a bit like a razor head, but you have like a special nappy that's like a cast, and you have to sort of pull yourself along a bit like a mermaid. So yeah, my childhood photographs are particularly nice.
Has this got anything to do about being double jointed?
Yeah. Double jointed is what they used to call hypermobility.
Oh, right, okay.
So double jointed people, you don't have a double joint. It just means the joint moves in both ways. So that's not about the joint, it's about the muscles that hold the joint. So if you're double jointed, it means you're hypermobile.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so what is Pilates before we start talking about it? So it was developed by a gentleman called Joseph Pilates during World War I. And he'd come from, his story is really interesting. He was like a child gymnast in Germany. But he also did like loads of other things. So he also did like martial arts and was involved in kind of, different sort of fitness regimes in Germany. And he was so good at it that Scotland Yard invited him to England before the First World War to teach the policemen of Scotland Yard how to be more agile and fight better and do a bit of martial arts and be fitter. And while he was at Scotland Yard doing that work, the war broke out, and because he was German, he was interred. But because he had this interesting background, he was interred in military hospitals. So he was first in one in London, and then he was sent to the Isle of Man. And that's where he developed his method. So he was working with injured soldiers who had maybe, had really life-changing injuries. And he started using the bed springs to kind of help people develop their muscle tone and improve their fitness while they couldn't walk. And on the ward where he worked, they had a much higher rate of people recovering from their injuries than they did on other wards, because he was going in every day and just kind of helping these people kind of get their confidence back, but also develop their physical fitness. So people often think about Pilates being like something that you do when you go to the gym because it's about fitness, but actually it's not. It was always about rehabilitation and helping with injury and helping with postural problems. So it comes from a clinical background, but it's sort of been adopted as kind of like an exercise thing, a bit like yoga. So the original exercises uses bed springs for resistance, and what they found was that people could retain strength and muscle tone even though they were lying down. So even though they didn't have to get up. Some people don't have maybe the use of their legs or for a period of time or ever. And he was still able to kind of help these people kind of develop their core muscles so that they could be more mobile once they recovered from their injuries. originally it was called controlology, which I actually think is a better name for it, because Pilates just sounds a bit sort of, it's just his name, but controlology actually is an indication of what it is, because it's very much about precision and control, regaining control over the body and things like that. He was able to heal himself from lots of childhood illnesses through physical exercise. So he was a great believer in being able to cure yourself through maybe applying different methods. And he knew a lot about lots of different methods, including dance. And now, this is from a couple of years ago, this statistic, so it's probably even higher, but they reckon now that 12 million people worldwide do some sort of Pilates method. Now, the sort of method you will do if you go to the gym isn't the Pilates method. The original Pilates method is like a repertoire, which is really hard. And actually, I've only ever seen one person ever perform the whole repertoire. I think I've only got one person that could do it, because you have to be incredibly fit and flexible. So the original method isn't what's taught now. Now, like adaptive Pilates is taught, but it's based on the original methodology. Did somebody want to come in? Hi, come in. Has anybody got any questions about that before we move on? Okay, so we've got a nice picture of Joseph Pilates and his wife Clara there at their studio in New York in the 1940s. And this is what's called a reformer. It sounds a bit scary, doesn't it? They still use, they have Pilates equipment, and they still use the reformer, which is the original piece of equipment that was developed from the bed in the hospital. So it looks a bit scary. Some of the Pilates equipment looks a little bit like kind of so you use to torture somebody. But actually it's just equipment that he used to kind of for resistance. So instead of kind of lifting weights, you would use resistance. So he's probably in his 60s there, I would think, Joseph Pilates, maybe 70s. So the principles of his method are about center, which is about the core of the body and the muscles in the core of the body. It's about concentration, so you really have to think about it. It's not something that you do passively, it's quite a kind of active thing. You know, sometimes with exercise, people like quite passive exercise because it means they can think about something else. Generally with Pilates, if you're doing it at a certain level, you have to really think about it because you've got to coordinate the body quite well. There's a breathing technique that comes with it that people learn when they learn Pilates, which is quite a deep breath. And it's very much about kind of exhaling on a movement, which is opposite to what you do in yoga. So quite often when I teach people who've done a lot of yoga, it takes them ages to get the breathing because it's opposite and they get really confused. It's a very precise form of exercise. So it's particularly good if you have hypermobile joints, because what tends to happen with exercise when you're hypermobile is that you'll go beyond your range of movement. You'll go bigger than you would usually, or what you're meant to. And quite often that doesn't get corrected. You quite often see people in gyms, especially, you know, the machine that people use to kind of tone their arms, this one. And hypermobile people in gyms, that's really bad. And it doesn't get corrected by anybody in the gym. Like, people are bringing their elbows all the way back and kind of compressing their spine. And the fitness instructor's like, and you're like, whoa, please don't do that. You'll end up with a kind of extension sprain in your back. It's about alignment, which again is really, really good for posture. So it's all about kind of the stacking of the spine and where things should naturally fit in the body, and about the flow. And the flow of it doesn't tend to come until you've been doing Pilates for a long time. You're meant to do it in like a flowing sequence, a bit like a dance, but you have to be really, really good at it before you can get to that point, because most people need a bit of a rest between exercises. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about hypermobility. So some of these things might be a little bit familiar to you. When I actually had my autism diagnosis, it was during the hypermobility study that they were doing at Sussex University. So when I went and had my diagnosis, the clinician that I saw actually asked me to do these things because they were looking into the co-occurrence at the time, which is about 4 or 5 years ago now. So I had this sort of really long, I had this really sort of long appointment where we were talking about my autistic traits, my childhood and stuff. And then at the end, she sort of asked me to do these things. I thought, that's a bit strange. And it was only when she explained to me why that I thought, okay, maybe that sort of makes sense. So what they use to test hypermobility in all people, not just autistic people, is something that's called the Baton score. and they ask you to do 5 things. And that's how they can tell whether you're hypermobile or not. So you have to score more than 4. So some of these things you might be able to do. So quite often the one that's really obvious if you're hypermobile in people is the back of the knee. So if you stand with your legs straight, that you get like a banana leg, if you like. So the joint bends backwards. And that's a hypermobile joint. Anybody who can put their palms of their hands on the floor has hypermobile hips, because that's a kind of a really extreme flexion movement. And some people have hypermobility in their hands, or their elbows. I don't have hypermobile elbows, but people who do have hypermobile elbows, when you straighten your arm, it goes beyond the range. So you would get that kind of curve in the arm. And you might have hypermobile wrists, which I have. And that's another one that they ask you to do to see if your thumb can touch your wrist. So has anybody ever done any of this stuff to kind of test their hypermobility?
My left wrist is hypermobile.
Right, okay.
My right one.
Yeah. It's not necessarily linear in the body, that you might have one wrist or one ankle, you don't necessarily. So, it might be that you want to kind of check a couple of those things out. Don't do C. Because nobody do C, just in case we don't want a back injury. But yeah, and I haven't got hypermobile fingers, but the finger one's a good one as well. Sort of, if your finger goes beyond 90 degrees, you've got hypermobile fingers.
Like in the gym, in those performances they do, and they go over and over on the carpet.
Yeah.
Some of them do some weird things, don't they?
Yeah.
Do you think they might?
You see a lot of hypermobility in gymnasts, especially, with the classic kind of thing at the end. Most gymnasts' legs are like way back, and that's hypermobility.
Is that to do with the autism?
You can be hypermobile and not be autistic, but what we see is that there are more autistic people that are hypermobile than in the general population. So it might be some of those. It might be that some of those gymnasts are autistic, or it might be that they're not. But you can be hypermobile and not be autistic at the same time. So that's how they test you for hypermobility. So have a little go at those. So that's how you would know. So it's the set of manoeuvres that they use to test. There's 9 points. Most people don't score the whole 9. You would have to be really hypermobile. But most people who are hypermobile score between maybe like 4 and 7. 7, you're really hypermobile at 7. And like I said, I've never seen anybody at a 9. But generally, it sometimes doesn't pair up. Sometimes it goes across the body as well, which is quite interesting. So you might have one hypermobile wrist and one hypermobile ankle, but it's on the other side of the body. So it just depends on, your physiology. So you get 1 point for each of the things that we've just seen. So if you can put your palms of your hands on the floor, you get a point. You get 1 point for each elbow if they go more than 10 degrees past the normal range of movement, and 1 point for each knee that go 5 degrees more than natural area of movement, and then the thumb and the wrist or the finger. So that is how they would test you for hypermobility. Has anybody ever had a test for hypermobility? Has anybody ever been asked to do any of this stuff? Okay, it's interesting. Does anybody know they're hypermobile? Yeah.
I used to spend years with my knees as a kid.
Yeah.
And it was only a chance encounter with a physiotherapist that I got referred.
Yeah.
And it was all the knees. I had knees in casts over school holidays and things.
Yeah.
Holidays. And it was only, say, a chance that I got referred. And the whole issue was caused by knees overextending.
Yeah. Yeah.
So standing, you have to consciously not overextend.
Yeah.
And I have measured inserts in the shoes to correct.
Yeah. Yeah, because quite often if you've got hypermobile knees, you roll out on your feet as well. So then you kind of get a problem with your feet, and all sorts of things can come from hypermobile knees, kind of hip problems.
In a few months.
Yeah.
So with these inserts, wear them for half an hour a day. And you won't be able to walk with them initially. Once you get used to them, you won't be able to walk without them.
Yeah.
So we're right. I didn't
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah.
Because you put them in and you couldn't stand on them for more than 2 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, because it rolled your feet in. Yeah. Okay. Has it helped though?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can walk and run miles now. It's whereas before it was just constant pain.
Yeah, brilliant. That's
away.
yeah, that's really interesting. Anybody else got kind of any kind of stories about kind of physiotherapy or anything? Because sometimes it's people have seen physiotherapists quite often if they're hypermobile. So hypermobility, it's more than joints. So your joints do move beyond the normal range. That's kind of how they identify it, but it's more than that. It's more than that, because when we think about the body and how the body moves, it's all about the central and peripheral nervous system, isn't it? So the central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord, and everything else is the peripheral nervous system. So that's kind of, they're like your body's motorways, if you like. That's how you can move, is because of the central and peripheral nervous system. So if there's a problem, come in. No, please come in. So if there's a problem with your hypermobility, it's going to affect your central nervous system, or be central nervous system connected. So they did a very recent study on this. It's all quite new, the science around hypermobility and the brain and the central and peripheral nervous system. But what they found when they did the study is that people who are hypermobile have what's called a hypervigilant nervous system. So it means we're more sensitive to stimulation that may cause panic, fear, fight, flight, fear, amygdala, adrenaline, all this sort of stuff. So people have an unusual reactive response who are hypermobile. Now that's quite interesting, because a lot of autistic people also have a much higher response to things like, to stimuli, which might make us more anxious, it might make us panic, it might make us not be able to cope with certain sensory circumstances or environments. There's also a heightened awareness of internal body signals and a hypersensitivity of pain or threat of pain. And I think the threat of pain is interesting, because I think quite often it's not necessarily that we've had an experience where we haven't liked it or we felt uncomfortable. It's the idea that it might feel like that puts us off doing it. So that almost sort of rubber stamps the experience that many of us have in our minds about things, where we think, I really don't want to do that because I think it might go wrong or it might not be pleasant. That's actually a real thing. It's connected to the brain and the central and peripheral nervous system. So it's not just kind of thought related, it's also body related. It's also about the nervous system, not just about our thinking patterns and our neural pathways in our brain. And the area of the brain that determines proprioceptive awareness, so that's where you are in space. So that's things like where your body is, where your joints and everything are in space. That can be diminished. That can mean that it's lessened, which means that our coordination is quite poor. Now, despite the fact that I teach Pilates, my coordination's pretty bad. I've got really good spatial awareness, like many autistic people have, but I find it quite difficult sometimes to walk through a doorway without banging myself on it, or going up a flight of stairs that I haven't been up before without banging my foot on it, or banging my knee on the coffee table that's been in the same position for the last 3 years, and every time I go past it, I bang my knee on it, because I don't quite know sometimes where my body is. And that's where the proprioceptive stuff comes in. So if your proprioceptive senses are lessened or heightened, and if you're hypermobile, things like clumsiness and not being able to coordinate ourselves are quite common. But sometimes that can kind of put us off things like exercise. It can put us off wanting to do, especially things like sports. I mean, I was petrified of sports as a child at school. I was absolutely petrified. I still can't catch a ball properly now. Like if somebody threw me a ball, it would just go past me because my brain wouldn't process the information quickly enough. But I've got really good body awareness, but that just doesn't work for me. So quite often, the people that need things like exercise and strengthening and, attending to their body avoid it because they think it's going to be unpleasant, that it's going to hurt, they worry about it, it's anxiety making. So it's quite interesting really that sometimes trying to get people to engage with something like Pilates is really hard because people have had negative experiences. They've been to classes where maybe they haven't been included, or they've been made to feel left out. They've tried to engage with sort of sports where, again, maybe they haven't been very good and people have ridiculed them, or they've been bullied. So quite often exercise is something that we just think, that's not for me as an autistic person, especially an autistic hypermobile person. That's not for me. I'm uncoordinated. I don't fit in. I don't like going to classes. I don't like meeting new people. I don't like being in a group. So what I've been trying to do in Brighton is create spaces and classes where autistic and neurodiverse people feel comfortable to come, which is why I've said it's a neurodiverse space only. This is a space for people like me and like the people that I teach, because I don't want other people coming into that space and making it something else. I don't want people coming into that space and passing comment. I don't want people coming into the space and saying, oh, this class is really slow. It's meant to be slow. Pilates is meant to be slow anyway. But you know, that's what tends to happen if at the times when I've kind of given in and somebody said, oh, can my sister come, or can I bring my friend? What's happened is it's kind of destabilised the space, because all of a sudden you haven't got somebody in there who maybe has that fear of it, or is worried about it, or anxious about it, and then starts kind of wanting their needs met in a different way. And then I can't meet the needs of the people that it's for. So I've been quite strict about it. And I've said, no, it's only for, you know, neurodiverse people. And most of those people, that's what really got me interested in starting to learn more about it. When I opened it up and said, I'm only going to teach neurodiverse people, it's mostly women. Nearly all of those women are hypermobile. So there is, I thought there must be a connection. And then when I looked into it, I realised that there was. Has anybody got any questions or comments that they want to make before I move on? No? Okay. Anybody had any experiences like that where they've tried to go to a class and it's all been a bit horrible? Yeah. Yeah, even when I was learning to be a Pilates teacher, and there was only like 5 of us, it was really quite hard actually, because it was sort of the groups sort of there was like 2 distinct groups right from the beginning. So there was like the really fit, stretchy pants kind of ladies, and then there was me and an older lady and a guy, and we sort of formed our own little group because, you know, it was a bit like, oh, you don't look like a Pilates teacher, you know, that sort of thing. But even in that space where you're kind of learning to teach, there was that kind of weird, you don't belong here because you don't look like a Pilates teacher. And it's like, well, what does a Pilates teacher look like? So I just thought I would include this in the presentation, just for people who are still kind of exploring where they are with their own sensory profile. Because I think our sensory profile is really, really important in terms of us managing our anxiety and managing, you know, things like panic, managing those awful feelings of feeling trapped and thinking, oh, I better not do that again because that was really frightening. If we know the things that are maybe hypo or hyper, if we know the things that are maybe frightening to us because they might be overwhelming, then we can navigate better. We can choose to come out of our comfort zone, but we can also choose to stay within it, which is really important. And for me here, talking about kind of exercise and the body, this is really important, I think. So people tend to know, autistic people or autistic young people who I would work with predominantly, tend to know about things like, you know, maybe I'm vulnerable to, you know, visual stress, or bright colours or bright lights. Maybe I don't like loud noises because they freak me out or they irritate me, or certain noises irritate me. Maybe really strong smells really make me feel weird or ill. Maybe certain tastes or textures feel weird in my mouth, so I avoid certain foods. Maybe I don't like the feeling of certain things, or maybe I really do. But what people don't tend to know about is that as part of that sensory profile, that includes our balance. So it includes our inner ear. So we might have issues with our balance. We might find going up and down stairs a bit weird, where we're like, oh, I don't quite know where that stair is. It's a bit strange. Or we might find things like standing for a long time odd because we have to sort of rock, or we can't quite stay still. Or we might just find walking on certain surfaces weird. I find certain types of carpet a bit weird. And one of my students at university used to really laugh at me because the room where I used to see him had this weird carpet outside, and I used to run across it, and he used to watch me through the window, sort of scurrying across it every week, because I didn't like the feel of it under my feet, because it made me feel like I was going to fall over. But it also extends to our proprioception, so our muscles on our joints where our body isn't in space, and our interoception, so the internal workings of our body. So things like, do I need to go to the toilet? Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Am I sick? Sometimes we don't know those things. I'm a classic not knowing when I need to go to the toilet sort of person, and which is why I always kind of need a wee. Like, that's kind of, I'm known for that. Like, it's like, oh my God, I've got to have a wee, Because I don't realise I need a wee until I absolutely desperately need a wee, because my body doesn't register it, my brain doesn't register it. So I'm like, fine. I used to drive my dad mad every time we went out in the car, and he'd keep saying, do you need to go to the toilet before you get in the car? No, Dad, I'm fine. And the minute we got in the car, I'd be like, I really need to go to the toilet. The minute we were on the motorway, and he'd be like, dear God. But it's because I didn't know. I wasn't doing it deliberately. I still don't know, which is why I actually put it in my calendar. In my work day, I actually put in toilet breaks in my calendar. So when I look at my calendar, I think, right, I'm going to the toilet now. Because I won't know, and then I'll be desperate in an appointment and I won't know what to do with myself. But it's also things like, in terms of physicality, and how strong and how kind of resilient we feel, fit we feel. We might not really know that. We might not kind of have an awareness of if we're fit or if we're not. You know, are we healthy? Are we not healthy? Are we in tune with that? Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. And I think it's just good to kind of think about those things about ourselves, because our bodies are really important. And I think sometimes as autistic people, we can be very much in our minds. We can be very much sort of, quite cerebral people, where we're very much, locked in our thoughts about things, and we really like to focus on things and learn about things like data. But we kind of forget that there's also a body attached to our mind that needs to be maintained, that we need to kind of maintain our health. And I don't know about you, but for me, doctor's appointments, going to hospital, those sorts of things, I really don't like that. I don't like people messing around with me at all, or with my body. So I often think that it's really important to autistic people to try and maintain our health so that we have less of that. We have less doctor's appointments, we have less hospital appointments, we have less intervention from those sorts of people, because it can be really quite stressful, can't it, going to hospital, having to have an injection or blood taken, or being touched by somebody we don't know in a clinical sense can be really unpleasant. Has anybody got any questions about that before we move on? No? Okay. Okay, so let's kind of get down to it. So if you were to try a bit of Pilates, you don't have to, of course, but if you were to try, the sort of things that it really helps with is posture is a big one, okay? Posture is an absolutely massive one for Pilates, because it's all about the spine. It's all about correcting the spine. So if we think about our day-to-day activities, and we think about the things that we all do, not just autistic people, but we all do in our modern life, we sit all the time. We sit down and drive, we sit down at the computer, we sit down to watch television, we sit. Sitting is really bad for our bodies. It's really, really bad. So what tends to happen is we sit all the time, is we develop a certain posture, and that posture is called a kyphotic posture. And it's about the upper bit of the spine. So if we sit a lot, what happens is eventually the spine becomes that shape, okay? So you get a bit of it's called a dowager's hump. It's a really nice word for it, isn't it? Where you get like a lump on the back of your neck. And people can't straighten, because these muscles have become very short and the muscles in their back have become very long. So when you think, right, I'm going to sit up straight, you actually can't, because your muscles are too tight. They've become hypertonic in the front of your body. So if you sit at a computer all the time, all day at work, and then you drive home and you sit on the sofa, and then one day you think, oh, I just want to stand up straight, you actually can't. So it's really important to do those kind of extension exercises, just so that the spine is able to move the way it's meant to. It also helps with things like stability. So if you're uncoordinated, developing that is really good. So if you're uncoordinated and you feel like, things like even just sort of running makes you feel odd or really unstable, things like Pilates can really improve that for people. They can start to feel more confident in their movements. It's also really good for things like, they did a study in Spain last year about Pilates in the older population and falls, and they found that the older population who did regular Pilates didn't fall as much. So they were less likely to do things like maybe have a hip injury or a leg injury as they got older. So that's all good. And your endurance, just things like your general physical fitness will improve if you do something like Pilates. Your functional movement will improve. So what I mean by functional movements is, lots of people go to the gym because they think, I want to be a bit more toned, or I want to do Pilates because I want a flat stomach. That's what I hear all the time. It's like, you have to do a lot more than Pilates to get a really flat stomach. But I'm talking about things like going up and down a flight of stairs. I taught a gentleman for 2 years who was in his 90s, and we just used to work on things like going up and down stairs, the movements that he needed to go up and down stairs, the movements that he needed to sit down and stand up, so that he could maintain his independence. Because the minute you can't go upstairs, or the minute you can't sit on and off a toilet, for example, you have to be cared for. And he didn't want to be cared for. So we just did loads and loads of exercises around him maintaining his independence. So that's what I mean by functional movement. It's not about the body beautiful. It's about actually being able to maintain our independence. Our muscle initiation and sequencing. So that's things like doing things in an order. And sometimes as we get a bit older, or if we're ladies and we're going through the menopause, and you get sort of menopause brain, sometimes things like that gets a bit muddled. Doing things in a sequence or forgetting a bit of the sequence can be quite difficult, and it does help with that, because doing things in an order in Pilates, you quite often do things in a sequence, and that helps you remember other sequences because it's about neural pathways. Your body awareness improves, your spatial awareness improves, coordination and balance. So that's universally, those things are really good for everybody. But if we're autistic people, having a better awareness of your body can help us stay well. Having better spatial awareness can help us kind of feel more confident about things. I used to certainly avoid certain things or situations because I'd think, maybe I'm going to fall over. Or for a long time, I wouldn't drive a car because I was really, really frightened I was going to be like really dangerous in a car, because I would just think, my depth perception and everything is really off. But actually, I do drive now and I'm okay with it. But I think things like doing Pilates really helped with that, because it gave me a bit of confidence that I actually did know what I was doing and what my body was doing, and I could sequence the movements better. And balance. Coordination and balance are really important for all of us, just in terms of our day-to-day lives. Going about our day-to-day lives, we need to be coordinated, we need to be able to balance well. It also helps calm the nervous system. Now, this is about breathing. There's lots of interesting studies done about breathing and anxiety, breathing and calming the nervous system, breathing and panic. And if any of you've got any kind of the apps, the mental health apps, lots of it is, if you're having a panic attack, you should breathe, and that'll sort out your panic attack. Generally, it doesn't sort out your panic attack. It's not that immediate where you take a couple of deep breaths and that's it, you're tip top. That's not the case. But if you regularly do a certain type of breathing or deep breathing, it does calm your nervous system down, and it can also give you the confidence that's a bit of a go-to thing if I start to feel my anxiety levels rise. Now, I'm not saying that it cures panic attacks or anxiety attacks. What I'm saying is that if you learn the breath, it gives you confidence to think, okay, I can just put a bit of space in here. I can just do a little bit of breathing and then I can gauge where I'm up to. Or I can do a bit of a body scan and accurately decide whether I'm having a panic attack or not. Because sometimes we can think we're about to have a panic attack, but we're not, but then we have a panic attack because we're thinking we're going to have a panic attack. So sometimes just having a bit of space in there can be really, really helpful. It's definitely helped me with things like sleep. I'm a chronically bad sleeper. I'm a dreadful sleeper. I always have been since I was a child. And it's definitely helped me with that. That just being able to just kind of be aware of my body and where I am and do a bit of breathing. Sometimes do a bit of Pilates in the evening, actually, if I've had a bit of a stressful day, just to calm everything down a little bit, do a bit of stretching, kind of realign myself. It'd be quite nice. And it can and does undo years of poor sitting and standing alignment. And we all have patterns in our standing and sitting where we don't do it properly. You never ever see anybody sit at a desk like this. Not even me. I do a bit of that. So we all do it. We all have bad sort of postures when we're sitting or standing. Very few people just stand. You stand for a period of time and then you do a bit of hip hiking or drop into one hip or load on one leg or whatever it is. And if you do that a lot, you develop the kyphosis that we talked about, or a lordosis, which is a curvature at the bottom of the spine. And what Joseph Pilates, his whole ethos really is about this quote at the bottom, which is a Joseph Pilates quote, which it's not about getting up every morning and going for a 4-mile run and then doing this and doing that and going to the gym. It's literally just about maybe doing a few movements a day, just adding it into your routine. It's much better than doing lots and lots of other things, maybe not particularly well. So I used to do a lot of swimming, which I don't do anymore, because I actually realised that I've got a bit of shoulder imbalance on one side, and it was actually feeding into that and making it worse. And I thought, I'm doing loads of swimming, that's really good for me, but actually I ended up with a bit of a shoulder injury because it just those movement patterns just don't work for me. So my osteopath advised me only to do like one stroke and not different strokes of swimming. So we're not talking about getting the stretchy pants on and going down the gym every day. We're talking about maybe adding in 5 or 10 minutes a day just to help improve posture. And actually lots of people, that's how they do their Pilates. They don't even go to a class. They learn a few exercises that work for them, that help to correct their alignment or their posture, or the things that are uncomfortable or painful or stiff in their body. And they just do that a few times a day, and that really helps them. Okay. So these are the different, I just thought I'd put this in there. I quite like these. I think they're quite funny. These are the postural differences that most of us have. So some of us have what's called a sway back, where the pelvis is tilted slightly forward. Now, if you've got a sway back, your weight is in your heels all the time. So what happens is the muscles in your back become really tight and short, because you're sort of sticking your chest out all the time. It's a bit like a kind of military posture. Then you've got what's called a lordosis. Quite often people with a lordosis have an injury. So they're trying to take the weight off something by sticking their bottom out. Usually it's like a lower back injury. Quite often people end up with a lordosis because they're just trying to kind of avoid pain by extending the lower back. There's the kyphosis that we talked about, which is the sitting posture.
The previous one, can it be innate? Can it be innate, or it's like a real accident?
People have, everybody's spine is a slightly different shape, so we all have a tendency towards one of these. So for me, I've got a really flat back, so I tend to be a bit kind of back on my heels. I have a tendency towards that, but I am able to correct that, yeah. Obviously, if you have something like a scoliosis with your spine has a curvature or a bend in it, you're not going to be able to correct that with Pilates, but you might be able to kind of just make sure you're not loading too much on the predominant side, for example. But we all have a tendency to be one or the other. And if anybody during the break wants a postural assessment, I'm quite happy to do that. I don't have to touch you to do it if anybody's interested. The forward head, which means that people push their pelvis too far back. And then good posture. I mean, come on, very few people are kind of going to stand like that. I probably stand like that when I'm teaching for about like 2 hours a week, but that's what you would need for good posture. And actually, I'll leave those up there during the break. If you try that, it's really interesting because you think, oh my God, that's working everything. Just standing. The front of my legs is switched on, my lower back switched on, my abdominals are switched on, my upper back, everything is kind of switched on if you just stand properly, which is why it's really hard, because you get tired really quickly if you stand like that. So I think the next slide is just, right, I'll just show you this before we finish. So this is Joseph Pilates at 57, okay? And this is Joseph Pilates at 82. So it clearly works, because looking pretty good. He actually died the year after that, so yeah. He was still really, really fit into his 80s. He did predict he was going to live till 100, but he didn't, unfortunately. But 57, you know, it gives me something to aspire to. So I'll leave those up there while we have our break. Has anybody got any questions before the break? I mean, if you want to just come and ask me something, you know, just one-to-one during the break, feel free to. And if anybody wants a postural assessment, I'm very, very happy to do that. I don't have to touch you to do the postural assessment. So if you're interested, I'm very, very happy to do a couple of those during the break. So is there any questions before we have delicious cake? No?
Are you going to touch on practical examples,
I can do.
or are you finished for the day?
Well, I can touch on practical examples if you'd like me to. Are there any specific practical examples?
Well, you talk about practicing, but we have no concrete examples or demonstration of what you're referring to.
Okay, what, like the sort of exercises that you would do?
Well, I think a few slides back, there was a quote about. Could you just flip
Yeah.
back a few slides, please?
That one?
Yeah, a few
Yeah.
well-designed movements. What are a few well-designed movements?
Okay, so there's a repertoire of Pilates. Okay, I didn't want to do loads of the exercises because I thought people would be like,
But I think you've gone to the extreme where
Yeah.
it seems to be quite conceptual
Okay.
rather than practical.
yeah,
You
okay.
can tell him to F off.
No, it's a good. I'll get him later. No, it's a good question. Okay, so what we're talking about
Rolling
is
her eyes behind you.
this. There's a beginner's repertoire, okay, which is about it's 12 exercises, and a lot of those exercises are done lying down on the floor, okay. So in terms of kind of going to a class, most people are quite surprised when they first come to a class because you spend most of it lying down on the floor, and people are like, this is quite nice. Once you've learned the breath and the initial repertoire, it then gets harder, but it doesn't have to get harder. You can just stay with the initial repertoire. So in the class that I do, my neurodiversity class, we only do 10 exercises an hour. So the hour class, we only do 10, but we do them in tiny, tiny little movements. So for example, if we're doing the roll down, which is where you sort of roll your spine down and bring your spine back up, we will start by doing the head, and we'll do a few of them. Then we'll start by doing like mini, and then we'll build up. And people stop where they're comfortable and just do repetitions of where they're at. So there's always room with Pilates for it to get harder, but there's also room for it just to remain really, really simple. Does that answer your question?
Are there particular resources? Is there YouTube or
Yeah.
something that you might recommend after the break
Yeah.
that people could go and have a look and maybe find examples,
Yeah.
worked examples of some of these exercises?
Yeah, there's loads and loads of stuff on YouTube, which of course varies in quality widely. But there is a website called Pilates Anytime. It is a subscription, but you can have like a free month or something on it, and that's really good. They're the best Pilates teachers in the world, so it's very American. You have to just kind of get your head around it. They've got a studio and it's on the beach, and it's all a bit lycra, but they are the best Pilates teachers in the world. So that there's stuff on there like Alan Herdman, who was taught by somebody who was taught by Joseph Pilates, has classes on there, and it's all very. I think he's got one class where you just do that for an hour. Just to sort of about, you know, how the joints work and stuff. So there's lots of resources that are really good. But yeah, don't just go on with YouTube and put in Pilates, because it'll just be people doing the 100 and you'll think, sod that. So
Thank you very much.
any more questions? No? Okay. Right, cake.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.